Long before the first white sails appeared on the eastern horizon, long before the sound of muskets or the shuffle of boots across new soil, this land, vast, endless, and sacred, belonged to the many native peoples who walked its forests, paddled its rivers, and followed the whispers of the wind across its golden plains. Each tribe had its own customs, its own rhythms, its own understanding of the earth beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. In the east, among tall trees and misty valleys, the Iroquois Confederacy ruled with wisdom and balance, binding 5 nations, later 6, into a political alliance built not on conquest, but on consensus, harmony, and peace. To the north, along the stony shores of the Great Lakes, Ojibwe fishermen cast their nets in cold, deep waters, their bark canoes slicing silently across the surface like the wings of birds. In the southeast, the Choctaw and Creek lived in well-organized towns, growing maize, beans, and squash in soft riverbed soil, while children played in the shade of cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. In the vast interior plains, where grass waved like an ocean and the sun seemed to pause in the sky, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche followed the buffalo, majestic beasts whose hides clothed them, whose bones became tools, and whose flesh sustained entire villages through bitter winters. Each morning in these lands began with the warmth of a fire, the murmur of song, and the smell of cedar smoke curling toward the stars. For even sleep was sacred here, a time to dream of ancestors and spirits. The people lived in harmony with nature, not as masters of it, but as its children, respecting the rivers as veins of the Earth Mother, honoring the mountains as the backs of sleeping giants, and watching the moon for messages from the spirit world. Time moved differently then, measured in seasons and hunts, in stories passed down from grandmother to grandchild, in sacred dances around the fire, the stomp of moccasins on dirt packed by time and memory. It was not an idle life, nor one without hardship, but it was rich with meaning. The hunters knew the land the way one knows a friend. Every path, every ridge, every animal sign. Women, the life-givers, tended the hearths and the crops, their work as vital and respected as the warriors. Children were raised not by a single pair of hands, but by the whole village. Each adult, a guardian. Each elder, a living library of wisdom. Their languages, hundreds of them, rolled like water, soft and rhythmic, shaped by the needs of each landscape and the stories each people told. Ceremonies marked every passage: birth, harvest, marriage, and death. The beating of the drum was the heartbeat of the people. The pipe, when smoked, sent prayers to the sky. The feather, worn in hair or carried in hand, was not decoration, but a mark of honor, of connection, of something deeply spiritual. To be a part of this world was to be woven into something far older and greater than oneself, a tapestry of ancestors, dreams, and silent understandings. There were no maps then, but the land itself was known in full. The secret springs, the medicine plants, the sacred stones. The sky was not empty. It was alive, filled with meaning and signs. Stars told stories. Animals brought omens. Even the wind had a name, a voice, and a purpose. To the people of this land, the world was not a thing to be taken or owned, but a sacred circle in which all things had a place. And so they lived, not as isolated tribes, but as nations, neighbors, and sometimes rivals, connected by trade, by marriage, by stories told in the flicker of firelight. This was the world before the strangers came, a world of deep silence, strong spirit, and unbroken rhythm. A world that would soon change forever, though for now, it rested in balance, breathing softly under the watchful eyes of the ancestors. And as the fire crackled and the stars watched from above, the people slept, dreaming dreams the earth still remembers. The first ships came like ghosts across the sea, their sails full of wind, and their hulls filled with stories, hopes, fears, and strangers. When they landed on these ancient shores, the people who stepped from them, pale-skinned, bearded, wearing heavy cloth and iron buckles, were as strange to the native people as the native people were to them. It was not war, not yet. At first, it was curiosity. The people of the land watched from the tree lines, cautious, wondering who these newcomers were and why they had come. They had seen strange objects before, beads, metal tools, and other tokens left behind by earlier European fishermen along the northern coasts. But now the strangers were not just passing through. They had come to stay. On the rocky shores of the northeast, Wampanoag eyes followed the pilgrims as they built wooden shelters, fumbling with the land, not knowing what to plant or how to survive the long, bitter winter. There was pity, perhaps, or at least the wisdom of the land saying, "Help them, for they are lost." Squanto, who had once been taken across the sea and returned, spoke their tongue and taught them how to plant corn, how to fish with traps made from reeds, how to listen to the land's quiet guidance. There were exchanges, furs for knives, maize for cloth, peace for now. Further south, in the lands of the Powhatan Confederacy, Captain John Smith wandered both fearful and fascinated, trying to map not only the land, but the people, their customs, and their words. Pocahontas, young and curious, crossed a cultural divide not with weapons, but with presence, a human bridge in a time of silence and suspicion. The early meetings between native tribes and the Europeans were moments of wonder, wrapped in misunderstanding. The strangers brought strange animals, horses, pigs, and cattle, that trampled crops and wandered into sacred spaces. They brought goods never before seen, steel pots, muskets, mirrors, and woven garments dyed with deep colors. But they also brought things darker and more silent, diseases that would ripple like fire through villages, unseen and unstoppable. Entire communities vanished before a single shot was fired. Still, for a time, there was hope that peace might grow. Tribes sought alliances through trade and diplomacy. They welcomed the newcomers with ceremonies and feasts. Pipes were smoked, words were shared. But always there was a gap, one of language, of worldview, of purpose. To the native people, land was something shared, not sold. It could be given for use, but never taken away forever. To the Europeans, land was a prize, a gift from God to be possessed and owned. The ground for friendship began to shift. Conflicts began to smolder like coals under ash, burning quietly, waiting for wind. Some tribes saw in the newcomers an opportunity to rise above rivals, and alliances were drawn not only between native and European, but among the native nations themselves. French traders moved along northern rivers, offering guns and goods to the Huron and Algonquin, while the British sought partners further south. The Spanish, meanwhile, came from the Southlands, bringing missions, crosses, and soldiers. The strangers came in many forms, not one people, but many, each with their own motives, their own gods, their own flags, their own ways. And so the web grew more tangled. The native world, once complex but familiar, was now shifting beneath their feet. The drums still beat in the night, the fires still warmed sleeping families, and the stars still danced across the sky. But the future had changed its course. Still, for now, peace held. It was not a loud peace, not a trusting peace, but a fragile one, wrapped in silence, observation, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, the strangers would learn to live as the people of the land had always lived, gently, gratefully, and with reverence. In the forests, in the fields, and along the rivers, life continued. But a question lingered in the air, drifting like mist above the morning dew. What had truly arrived with these strangers, and what would remain when they were done? As the moon rose over both villages and colonies, and the wind whispered through pine and corn stalks alike, the people lay in their homes, one people resting in ancient rhythm, the other dreaming of new worlds, both unaware that the peace between them would not last, and that soon the land itself would become a battleground, not just of bodies, but of ways of life. For now, though, the night was quiet, and the stars still watched over both. Time passed, as it always does, slowly yet inevitably changing the face of the land and the hearts of those who walked upon it. The fragile peace that once rested like morning mist between the native tribes and the newcomers began to thin, drifting away with each new ship, each new settler, each new clearing cut from the forest's patient arms. At first, the changes were quiet, barely noticeable. A patch of forest felled here, a trading post there, a strange fence built along a meadow that once belonged to no one and everyone. The treaties began, soft words inked onto parchment, agreements made between men who rarely understood each other's meanings, let alone each other's worlds. These treaties were offered as peace, framed as friendship, sometimes even as gifts. A few trinkets, a barrel of rum, or a bag of coins were traded for miles of sacred land, land that to the native people was not something to be sold or signed away, but part of their spirit, part of their story. But the white men brought maps, and with ink and quill, they began to draw lines where no lines had ever been. Territories were carved out like meat, divided by rivers, mountains, and the will of foreign kings. What had been hunting grounds for generations now became property, often claimed without even the courtesy of asking. The tribes were told that their ways were old, their customs backward, their lands unused and empty. But the lands were never empty. They were full of meaning, of memory, of breath and blood and song. Still, many tribes tried to adapt. They signed agreements, sometimes under pressure, sometimes under promise, sometimes simply out of desperation. They moved when they were told, hoping to keep peace, to protect their people from war, to preserve some sliver of their homeland for the next generation. But the land kept changing hands. The newcomers kept coming, wave after wave, like the tide refusing to recede. Colonies expanded, roads were built, forests fell. The buffalo herds began to shrink, the rivers grew crowded, and old trails were replaced by wooden wheels and hoofbeats. Even the names began to change. Sacred mountains were renamed. Rivers were charted and claimed. Places once spoken of only in stories were now marked on maps, their meanings reduced to mere labels. The treaties, once offered with ceremony and promises, were too often forgotten, broken, or rewritten when they no longer served the white man's interests. The native people found themselves pushed west, further and further, always westward, always away. For each treaty signed, another one was violated. For every promise made, another was broken. And yet, through it all, the tribes endured. They remembered. They told their children the stories of what once was, whispering the names of rivers now crossed with bridges, of meadows now fenced in and forgotten. Some resisted, some fled, some adapted. Councils were held beneath ancient trees. Leaders debated how to survive, how to protect their ways in a world that seemed to be vanishing beneath their feet. The land, once a great mother that fed and guided all equally, was becoming a battlefield of paper and pen, its fate decided not by hunters or spirits, but by governors, merchants, and soldiers. And still, the stars wheeled quietly overhead, unmoved by maps, untouched by treaties. The trees still whispered their secrets, though fewer ears were left to hear them. At night, the native fires still burned in secret corners of the forest, their smoke curling up like prayers into the night sky. The old song still echoed, though softly now, like wind through hollow reeds. And as each day passed, the question deepened, not just for the tribes, but for the land itself. How long could a people survive when their very roots were being pulled from the soil? And so, in the quiet of night, as the fire's glow dimmed and the drums fell silent, the people rested, not in comfort, but in waiting. Waiting for change, for vision, for the return of balance, or perhaps for the strength to endure whatever came next. For though the treaties came with kind words, the land was never fooled. It remembered who it belonged to. In the deep forests of the north, where pine trees whispered to the sky and rivers flowed like veins through untouched wilderness, a new kind of war was beginning, not one born from ancient tribal disputes, but from strangers fighting over a land they had only just come to know. The French and Indian War, as it would one day be called by the victors, was a conflict of empires, yet it unfolded on land sacred to many native peoples. To those native nations, it was not simply France versus Britain, but a collision of shadows, two foreign powers pressing inward, each demanding alliances, each offering trade goods, guns, and promises. They came with uniforms and flags, strange tongues and bold gestures, asking tribes to take sides in a war that was not their own. And yet, many tribes did choose, not out of loyalty to either European king, but in hopes of preserving their own survival, of protecting their lands, of choosing the lesser of two invading evils. The Algonquin and Huron leaned toward the French, who had long built trading relationships through rivers and furs, greeting native people with fewer settlers and more diplomacy. The Iroquois, wary of both, but threatened more directly by French ambitions, leaned toward the British, calculating their position with the same careful strategy they had long used to maintain balance among the native nations. War crept through the trees like a slow, heavy fog. Forts were built deep in the wilderness, wooden walls rising like unnatural teeth in places once visited only by hunters and spirits. Skirmishes flared near creeks and clearings. Native warriors, skilled in stealth and speed, became scouts and raiders for both sides, moving silently through the forests they knew like the back of their hands. But even as alliances were forged, trust was rare. The French made grand speeches in village councils, offering pipes, medals, and powder. The British did the same, sometimes louder, sometimes with more gold. Yet beneath every offer lay an expectation that native warriors would bleed for a crown across the sea, that they would turn their traditional weapons and sacred paths into tools for foreign conquest. And so the tribes found themselves pulled into a war that grew darker with every season. There were victories, ambushes, and proud defenses of territory, but also betrayals, villages burned, and entire communities caught in the crossfire of ambitions not their own. The land became a chessboard for men who had never walked its full length, who saw rivers as borders, not lifelines, and forests as obstacles instead of homes. Slowly, painfully, the war dragged on until finally the British, with greater numbers and deeper resources, gained the upper hand. In 1763, the war ended, but the peace that followed came with a deeper cost. The French ceded vast territories to the British, lands they had never truly owned, lands filled with native towns, hunting trails, and ancient burial grounds. And in that moment, many native leaders realized the true nature of the game they had been made to play. They had not been allies, they had been pawns, expendable when convenient, invisible when the ink dried on peace treaties written without their names. There was no victory in this war for the native peoples, only a shifting of strangers. Where once the French had built trading posts and sought alliances, the British now built forts and brought settlers, pressing ever westward with the confidence of conquest. Some tribes, feeling abandoned and threatened, rose in resistance. One of these, led by the great Ottawa leader Pontiac, sought to unite the tribes in a powerful uprising, burning forts, reclaiming territory, and reminding the newcomers that the land was not theirs to take without consequence. It was a fierce spark of defiance, but even this flame was eventually smothered beneath promises and punishments. Still, the war had changed the native world. It had revealed the dangerous entanglement of European power struggles and tribal sovereignty. It had shown that treaties meant little, that alliances were fragile, and that the strangers would fight one another to the death over land they did not yet understand. And so, as the war faded into history, as the uniforms marched on and the maps were redrawn once more, the native people returned to their villages and their ceremonies, quieter now, more cautious, but no less proud. The rivers still flowed, the trees still stood, but the shadows had grown longer, and at night, beneath the stars that had seen all things, the people wondered what new storm might come next, and whether their nations, their ways, their stories would still survive when it passed. After the cannons fell silent and the flags were folded away, a quieter kind of war began. A war not of rifles or redcoats, but of words, paper, and ink. The British had won the land, or so they believed, and the native tribes who had lived upon it for generations were now expected to move, to accept, to vanish politely into the shadows of treaties written in languages not their own. These treaties, some signed under duress, others signed in good faith, spread like footprints across the continent, each one marking a promise made and too often a promise broken. What the tribes asked for was simple: space to live, to hunt, to remain who they had always been. What they were offered were boundaries, lines on maps, assurances whispered in smoke-filled rooms, and the illusion of security. Time after time, the native peoples were told, "This land will be yours forever." But forever, it turned out, was short. The signatures of chiefs were recorded. Tribal marks were etched beside those of colonial agents. And for a brief moment, hope would rise. Perhaps this treaty would be honored. Perhaps this agreement would bring peace. But then, settlers came. Always more settlers. They came with wagons and axes, with fences and farms. They cleared forests, built cabins, plowed fields, and named their towns after generals and saints, forgetting or ignoring the old names, the ones whispered by wind and river. When the native people protested, when they reminded the officials of the promises made, they were told the treaties would be renegotiated. A new agreement would be drafted, this time pushing them a little further west, a little farther from their ancestral homes. Again, they signed. Again, they moved. Again, the cycle repeated. And so the land, once sacred and shared, became a patchwork of broken words, each treaty a scar upon the memory of the people. The trail of tears would come to symbolize this sorrow most painfully. A forced march of the Cherokee from their homeland in the green hills of the southeast, despite having tried, more than any tribe, to adapt, to coexist, to walk both worlds. They had schools, they had farms, they had even written their own constitution. But it did not matter. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed, and with it came the slow, grinding machinery of forced displacement. Thousands were marched westward, across frozen rivers and endless plains, under armed guard and bitter sky. Old men died along the path. Children were buried without ceremony. Mothers sang lullabies to sleeping babies who would never wake. It was not just the Cherokee. The Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole were all pushed from their lands. Some resisted, some ran, some tried to negotiate. But the promises once again were dust in the wind. And so, treaties became not symbols of peace, but instruments of removal. Some were signed with handshakes and ceremony. Others were forged, unsigned, or misrepresented. Still others were simply ignored when they no longer served the interests of the United States. For every treaty that gave, there was one that took more. For every boundary set, there came an excuse to move it. The land seemed to shrink with each generation, and the native nations found themselves pressed into smaller and smaller spaces. Reservations carved from once vast territories, like bones picked clean. Yet still, the people remembered. They remembered the rivers where their ancestors once fished, the valleys where stories were born, the stones that marked sacred ground. In council fires and winter lodges, they passed down the truth that the land had not been given away, not truly. It had been taken piece by piece behind the mask of parchment and pen. The treaties were not forgotten. They became part of the collective soul of the people, a trail of broken promises, of hope offered and snatched away, of trust betrayed by those who claimed to bring civilization. And so, in quiet moments, in dreams and dances, the elders still spoke of what was lost, not as relics of the past, but as living memory. The trees remembered. The rivers still carried those names. And somewhere beneath the soil, deeper than any plow could reach, the heartbeat of the old ways still pulsed, steady, waiting, listening. Though the treaties had failed them, the people endured. Their roots were deep, their stories were long, and the land, though wounded, had not forgotten whose it was. As the winds of change swept harshly across the great plains and dense woodlands, and as treaty after treaty faded into broken dust, something ancient stirred in the hearts of the native people. Something that had always lived quietly in the soil and smoke, but now began to rise like the morning mist. Resistance. This was not resistance born only of anger, though there was anger, nor solely of grief, though grief weighed heavy like storm clouds. It was a resistance born of memory, of sacred duty, of a connection to the earth that could not be fenced or bought. And in many corners of the continent, this spirit of resistance began to take shape, not just in warriors bearing arms, but in prophets speaking visions, in children learning the old songs, in mothers telling stories beneath the stars, and in elders reminding the people who they were. This was a time when figures began to rise, figures who would later be called rebels or heroes, depending on which history you read. But to their people, they were leaders of light. One such man was Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief who dreamed not of one nation, but of many nations standing together, united beyond tribal boundaries, bound not by conquest, but by shared survival. He and his brother, Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, traveled from village to village, urging the people to return to their traditional ways, to reject the goods and poisons of the white man, to form a confederacy that could withstand the tide of colonization. Tenskwatawa saw visions of a world where the native peoples were whole again, where the buffalo roamed freely and the rivers ran clear without white boats and rifles. His voice called out like thunder across the prairies, echoing in the ears of those who had forgotten their roots, stirring sleeping spirits. Tecumseh, with his strong voice and steady presence, turned those dreams into action, organizing resistance not just with words, but with alliances. He told the people that the land belonged to all tribes together and could not be sold by one without the consent of all. His dream was not war, it was unity, but war came anyway. At Tippecanoe, the Prophet's followers met American forces, and though the battle was small, it shattered part of the movement. Yet Tecumseh did not stop. He allied with the British during the War of 1812, still hoping to reclaim a homeland for his people. But his death in battle marked the end of that dream, and with it, the weakening of native unity east of the Mississippi. Still, resistance did not die. It flickered like firelight, carried westward, carried in spirit. On the northern plains, warriors like Sitting Bull, a leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota, would later rise, not for glory, but to protect what was left. He too had visions. He too stood against the growing force of the United States military. In the Southwest, leaders like Geronimo of the Chiricahua Apache refused to bow, leading daring escapes and attacks, slipping through deserts like shadows. Each stood, not as lone heroes, but as voices of their people, defenders of a way of life that was under constant siege. And while some took up arms, others took up words, traditions, dreams. The Ghost Dance, a spiritual movement that swept through native communities in the late 19th century, promised that the world could be renewed, that the dead would return, and the white man's world would crumble like dry earth. It was a dance of hope, of desperation, of faith in the unseen. It frightened the U.S. government, who could not understand its meaning and saw it only as a threat. But for the people, it was a prayer in motion. The resistance was never just about war. It was about survival in every form. In songs sung around dying fires, in children taught to remember their language even when forbidden, in ceremonies held in secret, the resistance lived on. The warriors were many, but so too were the prophets. Some carried bows, others carried dreams. Together, they held back the flood for as long as they could. And though many battles were lost and many homes were taken, the deeper battle, the one for memory, for spirit, for the sacred connection to the land, was never fully surrendered. In this quiet resistance, in this strength passed from elder to child, the people endured. And so, as night falls and the world grows still, their stories drift like embers in the dark, each one a quiet act of defiance, a reminder that even in sorrow there is courage, and even in the silence, the drums still beat. There are moments in history that echo louder than others, even in the hush of night. Moments when the air itself seems to hold its breath, when the land remembers every hoofbeat, every cry, every thunderclap of defiance. One such moment came in the summer of 1876 on the rolling hills and high grasses along the banks of the Little Bighorn River in what is now Montana. It was there that native warriors, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, Arapaho, gathered not as scattered tribes, but as a people united, drawn together by visions, warnings, and a deep, defiant need to protect what little remained of their world. Their leaders were not just warriors, they were guardians of memory and land. Sitting Bull, the spiritual heart of the movement, had seen a vision of soldiers falling like grasshoppers from the sky, and in that dream, his people found a sliver of hope. Alongside him stood Crazy Horse, a quiet and fierce Oglala Lakota leader whose courage in battle had become legend. These were men who did not fight for conquest or glory or the favor of any distant government. They fought for the sacred, for the rivers that remembered their ancestors, for the freedom to live without fences or forts. At the same time, the United States government had grown weary of these free-roaming bands, especially as gold was found in the Black Hills, lands guaranteed to the Lakota by treaty, yet suddenly seen as too valuable to honor. And so, General George Armstrong Custer was sent west, his blue-coated cavalry thundering through the grass like a storm on horseback, sure of victory, unaware of the power that waited beyond the bend. Custer was bold, some say arrogant. He believed his smaller column could strike a decisive blow, catching the native camp by surprise. But what he found was not a scattering of tents, but a vast encampment, thousands strong, alive with the smoke of cooking fires and the hum of families gathered for a sacred ceremony. There, by the river, the people had come together, not in fear, but in unity. On June 25th, the battle began. It did not last long, but it burned hot and bright. The warriors, mounted and fierce, surged like waves, surrounding Custer's men, cutting them off, fighting not for strategy but for survival. Bullets and arrows filled the air. Horses screamed. War cries rose above the clatter of rifles. And when it ended, the dust settled over silence. Custer and over 200 of his men lay dead, an entire detachment wiped out in what would be remembered by some as a tragedy, and by others as a final, brilliant flash of resistance. To the native people, it was not simply a battle. It was a stand, a declaration that they were still there, still strong, still bound to the earth beneath their feet. But even victory came with a shadow. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, though a triumph in the moment, became the beginning of an even harsher backlash. The U.S. Army, humiliated, returned with greater force and determination. Within a year, many of those who had fought in that battle would be dead, captured, or forced onto reservations. Crazy Horse would be killed, betrayed under a flag of truce. Sitting Bull would live for a while longer, always watched, always hounded, a ghost of the great free plains. Yet the story of the Little Bighorn lived on, not just in books or battle reports, but in the hearts of the native people. It was told in lodges and whispered beneath the stars, not as a tale of conquest, but of courage. It was proof that even in the face of impossible odds, a people could rise, could fight, could hold the line, if only for a day. The hills still remember. The river still carries the echoes of hoofbeats. And though the grass has grown back and the rifles are rusted, something sacred lingers in that place. It was not the last battle, but it was the last great stand of a free, unified native resistance before the full weight of the American westward machine came crashing down. And in the stillness of night, as the wind hums through forgotten trails, you might still feel it, the pride, the sorrow, the power of those who stood when all else seemed lost. They remind us that resistance is not always about winning. Sometimes it is simply about refusing to disappear. The vast plains of the American West, once alive with the rhythm of buffalo herds and the voices of countless native nations, had grown eerily quiet by the late 19th century. The great migrations of people and animals that had shaped this land for centuries were disrupted, halted by the relentless advance of settlers, soldiers, and laws designed to reshape the continent in the image of a distant government. The native peoples who had roamed freely, following the buffalo and seasons, now found themselves confined to reservations, small, fenced-off patches of land, far removed from the sacred rivers, lush forests, and vast hunting grounds that had defined their lives. These reservations, often chosen for their isolation rather than fertility, presented a harsh new reality. The soil was poor, the water often scarce or polluted, and the game nearly vanished. This dramatic shift was not just a change of address, but a wrenching upheaval of culture, spirit, and survival. For centuries, the buffalo had been more than just an animal to the plains tribes. It was a symbol of life itself. Food, shelter, tools, and ceremony, all drawn from this great beast that roamed the grasslands in millions. But by the 1880s and 1890s, the buffalo population had been decimated almost entirely, hunted by commercial hunters and soldiers who saw them as obstacles to railroad expansion and settlement. With their primary source of sustenance and spirituality gone, the native peoples faced a profound crisis. Hunger and despair settled over the reservations like a cold fog. Government agents arrived with promises of aid, food, and supplies, but these were often insufficient or delayed, leaving many families to endure harsh winters and meager rations. Alongside this material hardship came the painful erosion of native cultures. Government policies now aimed to assimilate native children into white society, removing them from their homes and placing them in boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their languages, practice their ceremonies, or wear their traditional clothes. These schools, though intended as civilizing institutions, were often places of loneliness and harsh discipline, where children were punished for remembering who they were. Across the reservations, elders watched helplessly as the threads of their heritage were pulled apart, generation by generation. Yet even in this dark time, the human spirit sought light, and it found it in the unexpected form of a new religious movement, the ghost dance. Originating with the northern Paiute prophet Wovoka, who preached a message of renewal and hope, the ghost dance promised that if the people danced and prayed, the world could be made new again. The buffalo would return, the settlers would vanish, the old ways would be restored, and the ancestors would walk the earth once more. It was a spiritual revival, a breath of fresh air amidst the suffocating despair. This dance was more than just a ritual. It was a desperate plea for survival, a reclaiming of identity in the face of erasure. As the ghost dance spread from tribe to tribe, among the Lakota, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and others, it gained momentum and meaning. To many native people, it was a sign that their prayers were heard, that their suffering would not be eternal. It inspired hope and unity, a shared belief that the world could be healed. But to the U.S. government and white settlers, who viewed native peoples through a lens of fear and misunderstanding, The ghost dance was seen as a threat, a sign of impending rebellion. The movement's growing popularity alarmed officials, who increased military presence on reservations to monitor and suppress it. At Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, home to the Lakota Sioux, tensions ran especially high. The government appointed agents who were often corrupt or indifferent, and the people lived under a constant watchfulness that bred mistrust and anxiety. The winter of 1890 was bitter and long. Food was scarce, spirits were weary, and the soldiers' boots crunched through frozen earth, a harsh reminder that peace was fragile. The native people danced their prayers beneath star-filled skies, hoping for the dawn to bring a world restored. But the government prepared for conflict, sending troops to control what they believed was an uprising waiting to explode. The atmosphere was thick with fear of violence, fear of loss, fear of the unknown future. This was the silence before the storm, the fragile calm before a tragic clash that would shatter lives and echo through history. On that quiet night, as snow dusted the plains and fires flickered in lodges, the people clung to their songs, to their memories, to each other. They did not know that dawn would bring devastation, that the dreams carried in the ghost dance would be met with gunfire. And yet, even as the world darkened around them, their hearts held fast to hope in the sacred connection to the land, reminding us all that even in the deepest silence, the spirit endures, waiting patiently for the winds of change to carry its song once more. The dawn that broke over the South Dakota plains on December 29th, 1890, carried with it a chill sharper than the winter wind, a cold that would settle deep into the bones of history. What began as a tense attempt by the U.S. Army to disarm a group of Lakota Sioux gathered near Wounded Knee Creek soon spiraled into one of the most tragic and violent episodes of the Indian Wars, an event that would come to symbolize the harsh end of Native resistance on the Great Plains. The soldiers, part of the 7th Cavalry, the very regiment once led by General Custer at Little Bighorn, were tasked with arresting Chief Bigfoot, a leader who had recently returned to the reservation with his band after fleeing earlier conflicts. Bigfoot and his people, weary from hardship and hoping for peace, had come to the agency to seek shelter and assistance. But fear and misunderstanding filled the air. The government was determined to stamp out any sign of unrest, especially the ghost dance, which was still being practiced and seen as a threat. The soldiers encamped near Bigfoot's band, their weapons ready, their eyes wary. The native people were cold and hungry, dressed in thin clothing that did little to protect against the biting winter. The tension was palpable, a thin thread stretched tight over frozen ground. On that bitter morning, soldiers began the process of disarming the Lakota. It was a task filled with unease on both sides. Men who had lived through years of war now facing relatives and neighbors, the air thick with fear and confusion. Then, in the chaos that followed, a shot rang out. Nobody knows exactly who fired first, and the mystery only deepens the sorrow. What followed was a sudden and terrible eruption of violence. Soldiers opened fire with rifles and artillery, and in the chaos, warriors and women and children alike were caught in the storm of bullets. The Lakota, many without weapons, were overwhelmed but fought desperately to protect their families. The snow quickly soaked with blood, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the silent hills. Estimates say that around 150 to 300 Lakota were killed, many of them women and children. On the soldiers' side, about 25 men died, including some who tried to help the wounded. This was no battle, it was a massacre. The horror at Wounded Knee marked a devastating turning point. It was the last major armed conflict between Native tribes and the United States government, a brutal punctuation to decades of broken treaties, forced removals, and cultural destruction. In the aftermath, the surviving Lakota were confined more strictly to reservations, their freedoms further restricted. The ghost dance movement was stamped out, and Native ceremonies were outlawed. The government tried to present the massacre as a military victory, and several soldiers received medals of honor, an action that remains deeply controversial and painful to many to this day. For the Native peoples, Wounded Knee was a wound that would never fully heal, a symbol of loss, not only of life, but of a way of life, a culture, a connection to the land that had been fought for over generations. It was a silence filled with grief, but also with remembrance. Stories of that day were passed down in whispers and songs, in tears and prayer. The massacre cast a long shadow, but it also sparked a slow awakening among some Americans to the injustices faced by Native peoples, eventually contributing to the beginnings of a broader movement for Native rights and recognition. In the years that followed, despite the crushing weight of loss and oppression, Native communities continued to hold fast to their identities and traditions. They kept alive the languages, the ceremonies, and the histories, often in secret, beneath the watchful eyes of those who sought to erase them. The resilience born of such suffering became a quiet rebellion, a steady heartbeat beneath the surface of a changing world. The land around Wounded Knee remains sacred ground, a place where the past is never far away. Visitors who walk the plains today often speak of a stillness that feels charged with memory, as if the spirits of those who fell that cold December day are still present, reminding us of the cost of colonization and the enduring strength of those who resist erasure. And so, the story of Wounded Knee is not only one of tragedy, but also of survival. It reminds us that history is not just battles and dates, but people who loved, who hoped, who fought to hold on to their humanity in the face of overwhelming odds. It calls us to remember, to listen, and to honor the lives and legacies of those who came before. As you rest, drifting slowly toward sleep, let the echoes of that snowy morning fade gently, carrying with them a quiet lesson that even in the darkest moments, the spirit of a people endures, and through remembrance, their stories live on. After the tragic events at Wounded Knee, the lives of Native Americans in the Great Plains entered a new and difficult chapter, one marked by enforced confinement, cultural disruption, and daily struggle for survival. The era of open conflict had come to a close, but what followed was a prolonged period of hardship and resistance that stretched quietly across the reservations. These lands, designated by the U.S. government, were often small, remote, and far from the natural resources that had sustained Native communities for centuries. The reservations represented both a physical and spiritual confinement. Families who once followed the rhythm of the seasons and the migrations of the buffalo now faced borders made not by nature, but by laws and fences. The land was often poor and unable to support traditional hunting and gathering. Farming was introduced as a supposed solution, but many reservations lacked fertile soil, and few natives had experience with European-style agriculture. Government agents oversaw daily life, controlling food distribution and enforcing policies that aimed to reshape native identity. This control extended to education, with the introduction of boarding schools designed to assimilate native children. These schools, often far from home, sought to erase indigenous languages and customs in favor of English and Euro-American culture. Children were punished for speaking their mother tongues or practicing traditional rituals, leaving many caught between two worlds, never fully accepted in either. Despite these pressures, native peoples showed remarkable resilience. Communities adapted, blending old traditions with new realities. Storytelling remained a vital thread that connected generations, preserving histories, languages, and spiritual beliefs, even when outward expressions were restricted. Elders passed on knowledge quietly, in homes and hidden gatherings. The struggle for survival was not just physical, but cultural, a fight to keep identity alive under circumstances designed to erase it. Economically, life on the reservations was often bleak. The loss of the buffalo and other game meant that traditional food sources were gone, replaced by government-issued rations that were unreliable and insufficient. Many families faced poverty, malnutrition, and disease. Unemployment was widespread, as the restrictions on land and resources limited opportunities for self-sufficiency or trade. Yet, even amid such adversity, moments of hope emerged. Some native leaders advocated for their people, pushing back against unjust policies and striving for better education, healthcare, and economic support. Tribal governments began to form, asserting their rights and sovereignty within the constraints imposed by federal law. The early 20th century saw a rise in political activism among Native Americans, sowing seeds for future movements. In everyday life, cultural practices adapted rather than disappeared. Ceremonies were held in secret, songs sung softly beneath the stars, and languages kept alive through whispered prayers and stories. Crafts and art became ways to express identity and sustain communities. The resilience of the people became a quiet revolution, a testament to the enduring spirit that no amount of hardship could fully extinguish. The reservation experience was also a time of profound change in relationships, with the land, with the government, and with each other. While some native people found ways to negotiate with the federal authorities, others resisted more openly, refusing to abandon sacred sites or traditions. These acts of resistance, whether large or small, kept alive the hope that one day justice and freedom might be restored. The aftermath of Wounded Knee and the reservation era is a complex story of loss and survival, oppression and resilience. It reminds us that history is not simply a series of battles won or lost, but a living, breathing experience of people striving to maintain dignity, culture, and life itself. As you listen and drift deeper into sleep, imagine the quiet strength of those who endured, who held on to their stories even when the world tried to silence them. In their struggle, we find a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope can persist, carried softly on the wind and kept alive in the hearts of those who remember. While the physical boundaries of reservations confined many Native American communities, the true spirit of their people could not be so easily contained. In the face of relentless pressure to assimilate, erase traditions, and abandon old ways, native cultures found ways to endure and quietly resist. This period, marked by hardship and loss, was also the foundation of a cultural resilience that would eventually give rise to movements of revival and renewal throughout the 20th century and beyond. Life on the reservations was shaped by the daily struggle to preserve identity amidst an environment often hostile to native customs. Although many ceremonies were banned or restricted by the government, they were still practiced in secret. Elders and spiritual leaders passed down sacred knowledge through hushed voices, teaching younger generations the songs, dances, and stories that carried the history and values of their people. These acts of quiet defiance were more than mere tradition. They were lifelines, preserving a connection to ancestors and to the land itself. Art and craftsmanship became powerful tools of cultural expression and survival. Beadwork, quillwork, weaving, and carving not only provided practical objects, but also carried symbols and stories. These artistic traditions were often taught within families and community groups, becoming a source of pride and a way to assert identity in a world that sought to erase it. Museums and collectors at the time often viewed native art as relics of a vanishing race, but for the communities themselves, these works were living, breathing parts of their heritage. Education, though often used as a tool of assimilation, also became a place where seeds of change were planted. Some Native Americans who attended boarding schools learned English and new skills, which they later used to advocate for their people. Despite the trauma and cultural dislocation caused by these schools, many survivors carried forward a desire to rebuild and reclaim their heritage. They formed networks, organizations, and alliances, fostering a sense of unity across tribes that had once been divided by geography and circumstance. Throughout the early to mid-20th century, this growing political and cultural awareness led to increased activism. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 granted U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans, but it did not end discrimination or restore lost lands and rights. In response, Native leaders and communities began organizing more formally to fight for sovereignty, self-determination, and recognition. Groups such as the National Congress of American Indians, founded in 1944, became platforms to address issues ranging from treaty rights to education and healthcare. Simultaneously, the preservation of language became a vital part of cultural survival. Languages, the carriers of history, worldview, and identity, were endangered due to boarding schools and government policies. However, many tribal members worked tirelessly to teach their languages to children and document them for future generations. Today, revitalization efforts continue with language classes, immersion schools, and technology helping to breathe new life into native tongues. Ceremonies, dances, and spiritual practices that had been suppressed began to re-emerge publicly in the 20th century. Powwows, gatherings featuring traditional dance, music, and storytelling, became spaces where communities could celebrate culture openly, share traditions, and educate others. These events grew in popularity and significance, fostering pride and connection, both within Native communities and with the broader public. Despite the many challenges, the strength of Native American identity persisted and grew. The stories of resilience, adaptation, and hope carried through the generations, becoming a testament to the endurance of spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. This cultural revival was not a return to a frozen past, but a dynamic, living evolution, one that honors ancestors while embracing the present and looking toward the future. The legacy of this resilience continues to inspire and inform today's movements for indigenous rights, land restoration, and cultural preservation. Across the United States and beyond, Native American communities assert their sovereignty and strive to heal from centuries of trauma. Their voices, once silenced or ignored, now demand recognition and respect, reminding all of us that history is a living story, shaped by those who survive and remember. As you rest now, drifting gently towards sleep, imagine the quiet strength flowing through those who came before, through whispered prayers, hidden ceremonies, and the steady heartbeat of a people who refused to vanish. Their journey reminds us that even when the world grows dark, hope flickers softly like a candle in the night, ready to light the way forward. The early decades of the 20th century marked a turning point in the story of Native American peoples, a time when the quiet strength of individuals and communities began to rise more visibly into the light of political advocacy and cultural preservation. After years of hardship on reservations and the trauma of displacement and assimilation policies, Native leaders emerged to voice the concerns and hopes of their people, laying the groundwork for future movements that would demand justice, recognition, and sovereignty. Among these leaders were figures who combined traditional wisdom with new education and political savvy, navigating the complex and often hostile environment of Washington, D.C. and state capitals. They worked tirelessly to challenge the policies that had long oppressed their communities, policies that confined them to reservations, undermined their cultures, and denied them basic rights. These leaders often faced enormous obstacles, including prejudice, limited resources, and the challenge of uniting diverse tribes with different histories and languages. One significant milestone was the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924. This law granted U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States, a status that had previously been granted only to some through treaties, military service, or individual applications. While the act was intended to integrate Native peoples into American political life, it was also met with mixed feelings. Many Native Americans saw citizenship as a double-edged sword, a legal recognition of their existence as citizens, but not an end to the discrimination or loss of sovereignty they continued to suffer. Voting rights, for instance, remained restricted in many states well into the mid-20th century, and efforts to maintain tribal governments and cultural autonomy were often undermined. Native leaders responded by forming organizations to protect their interests and assert their rights. One of the most important was the National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, founded in 1944. This group became a powerful platform for tribes across the country to unite and advocate on issues such as treaty rights, education, healthcare, and legal recognition. The NCAI provided a voice for Native Americans at the federal level and helped coordinate efforts to fight unfair policies and promote cultural preservation. In addition to political activism, the early 20th century saw important cultural revitalization efforts. Leaders and community members worked to preserve and teach Native languages, traditional crafts, and spiritual practices. This cultural renaissance was a quiet yet powerful form of resistance against decades of forced assimilation. Schools began to change their approach, and some tribal communities established their own educational programs to ensure that children learned about their heritage in addition to mainstream subjects. Military service also played a significant role during this period. Many Native Americans served in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War I and World War II, demonstrating courage and commitment despite the injustices they faced at home. Their service helped raise awareness about Native issues among the broader American public and fueled demands for greater respect and rights upon their return. The story of Native leadership in this era is one of resilience, determination, and hope. Despite immense challenges, these leaders kept the flame of their people's histories and cultures alive, reminding both their own communities and the wider world that Native Americans were not relics of the past, but vibrant peoples with a rightful place in the present and future. As you listen and settle further into rest, imagine the voices of these leaders, soft but firm, carrying the weight of centuries of struggle and the light of a hopeful tomorrow. Their legacy is a testament to the enduring spirit of a people who continue to seek justice and preserve the richness of their heritage against all odds. As the 1930s dawned, the United States was engulfed in the Great Depression, a time of economic hardship and uncertainty that touched every corner of the country, including the Native American reservations. This decade of struggle also brought an unexpected opportunity for change in federal policies toward Native Americans. The New Deal, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's sweeping set of programs aimed at recovery and reform, included provisions that would affect Native communities in ways both hopeful and complex. Before the New Deal, government policies had largely focused on assimilation and the breaking up of tribal lands. The Dawes Act of 1887, for example, had divided tribal lands into individual allotments in an attempt to encourage farming and civilize Native Americans according to Euro-American ideals. This policy, however, led to the loss of millions of acres of tribal land, sold off to non-native settlers and speculators. By the 1930s, many tribes had been left with only a fraction of their ancestral territories, and the social and economic conditions on reservations were often dire. Into this difficult landscape stepped John Collier, appointed Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1933. Collier was a reform-minded advocate who believed that Native American cultures should be preserved rather than eradicated. He sought to reverse many of the damaging policies of the past through legislation and programs that aimed to restore tribal self-governance and cultural pride. One of the most significant changes came with the Indian Reorganization Act, IRA, of 1934, also known as the Wheeler-Howard Act. This law ended the policy of allotment, halted the sale of tribal lands, and encouraged tribes to establish their own governments. The IRA provided funds for economic development and education, and recognized the importance of tribal sovereignty. While it was not perfect and met with mixed reactions from Native communities, some seeing it as another form of government control, it marked a major shift in federal Indian policy. Under Collier's leadership, new programs sought to improve conditions on reservations. Efforts were made to support Native crafts and arts, helping communities sustain traditional skills while generating income. Healthcare and education saw increased attention, with new schools and clinics opening in some areas. Collier also encouraged the practice of traditional ceremonies and religious freedom, lifting bans that had been imposed on sacred dances and rituals. However, the New Deal reforms faced challenges. The administration's policies sometimes clashed with tribal customs and priorities. Not all tribes welcomed the imposed forms of governance, and some felt that the changes did not go far enough to restore true autonomy. Additionally, funding and implementation were inconsistent, and many Native Americans continued to live in poverty and face discrimination. Despite these difficulties, the New Deal era planted important seeds for the future. It was a time when the federal government began to recognize, at least in part, the value of Native cultures and the need to involve Native Americans in decisions affecting their own lives. This shift laid the groundwork for later advances in civil rights and self-determination during the mid to late 20th century. As the world edged closer to World War II, many Native Americans would soon find themselves called upon again to serve their country, even as they continued to fight for recognition and respect at home. The lessons and changes from the New Deal period echoed forward, reminding us of a slow but significant transformation in the relationship between Native peoples and the U.S. government. Now, as you relax deeper into your restful state, imagine the quiet resilience of those years, the hope born from new policies, the courage to hold on to tradition amid change, and the steadfast spirit of communities working toward a better future. It is a reminder that even through hardship and uncertainty, the seeds of renewal can take root, waiting patiently for the right moment to bloom. As the world plunged into the chaos of World War II, Native American communities faced yet another profound challenge. Though long marginalized and often ignored by the broader society, thousands of Native American men and women answered the call to serve in the U.S. military. Their participation in the war effort was remarkable, both in number and spirit, and it would have lasting effects on their communities and their place in American society. Despite the hardships many Native Americans faced on reservations, poverty, poor living conditions, and limited opportunities, young men volunteered in numbers that exceeded their population proportion. It is estimated that about 44,000 Native Americans served in the armed forces during the war. This included members of nearly every tribe, from the Navajo and Apache in the Southwest to the Lakota and Ojibwe in the Plains and Great Lakes regions. One of the most famous contributions came from the Navajo code talkers. These brave men used their native language to develop an unbreakable code that the U.S. military employed for secure communications in the Pacific Theater. Their code was based on the Navajo language's complexity and nuances, making it virtually impossible for enemy forces to decipher. The code talkers' work saved countless lives and helped turn the tide in critical battles. However, their role remained classified for many years after the war, and only recently has their heroism been widely recognized. For many Native Americans, military service was more than just a duty. It was a way to prove their patriotism and valor, even as their own people continued to face discrimination at home. The experience of serving abroad exposed them to new ideas, cultures, and opportunities. Many veterans returned with a broader worldview and a renewed determination to advocate for their communities. Back on the reservations, the war effort brought some economic changes. The demand for war supplies and increased industrial production opened jobs in cities and defense plants. This spurred a wave of migration as Native Americans left reservations to find work in urban areas. This shift brought both opportunity and challenges, as many had to adapt to new environments and navigate unfamiliar social dynamics. The war years also accelerated conversations about civil rights and equality. Native veterans returned home expecting recognition, not only for their service, but also for their rights as citizens. Their sacrifices highlighted the contradictions in a society that celebrated their contributions on the battlefield, but continued to restrict their freedoms and autonomy at home. In response to these realities, Native Americans became increasingly active in political and social movements. The post-war period saw the growth of organizations dedicated to securing treaty rights, improving education, and addressing health disparities. Veterans played a key role in this activism, bringing leadership skills and a sense of solidarity forged in the crucible of war. Despite the progress, the path was far from smooth. Government policies in the late 1940s and 1950s, such as the termination policy, aimed to end the special relationship between tribes and the federal government. This policy sought to assimilate Native Americans further into mainstream society by terminating federal recognition of many tribes and ending aid programs. The result was often the loss of land, resources, and cultural identity for affected communities. However, Native peoples resisted these policies fiercely. Tribal leaders and activists worked to protect their sovereignty and rights, setting the stage for the more widespread civil rights movements of the 1960s and 1970s. The legacy of World War II veterans was instrumental in these efforts, reminding the nation that Native Americans were not only citizens, but also vital contributors to the country's fabric. As you continue to relax and your thoughts drift gently away, picture the strength of those young warriors, far from home, carrying the hopes of their families and ancestors with them into battle. Their courage in the face of global conflict echoes softly through history, a steady rhythm beneath the surface of change and renewal. They remind us that even when the world is at its most uncertain, the human spirit can shine with quiet brilliance. As the guns of World War II fell silent and soldiers returned home, Native American communities faced a new set of challenges, ones that were often just as difficult as the battles fought abroad. The hope that military service would lead to greater equality and recognition met with the harsh reality of ongoing discrimination, poverty, and political struggle. Yet, through it all, the spirit of resilience and determination persisted, guiding Native Americans toward renewed efforts to reclaim their rights and sovereignty. The immediate post-war years brought economic and social shifts. Many Native veterans who had served in the military returned to reservations, but others stayed in cities, having found work in the growing industries of urban America. This migration to cities was both an opportunity and a challenge. For many, the transition was difficult, adjusting to new ways of life while grappling with discrimination and alienation. The bonds of community, so strong on reservations, were often stretched or broken. Yet, even in new environments, Native Americans found ways to connect and support each other, forming urban Indian centers and organizations. One of the most significant federal policies of this era was the termination policy, introduced in the late 1940s and gaining momentum through the 1950s. The policy aimed to end the special relationship between the U.S. government and Native tribes, effectively terminating federal recognition of many tribes. This meant the loss of federal aid, legal protections, and, in many cases, tribal lands. The policy was part of a broader push toward assimilation, encouraging Native Americans to integrate fully into mainstream society, often against their will. Termination devastated many communities. Without federal support, social services and healthcare deteriorated, and many tribes faced legal battles to protect their remaining lands. The policy also threatened cultural survival, as tribal governments were disbanded or weakened. But Native Americans did not accept these losses quietly. Tribal leaders, activists, and communities fought back, organizing legal challenges and lobbying Congress to halt terminations and restore recognition to affected tribes. Parallel to the fight against termination was the growing movement for self-determination. Native Americans increasingly demanded the right to govern their own affairs, control their lands, and maintain their cultural traditions without interference. This shift was part of a larger civil rights awakening across the United States, where marginalized groups sought justice and equality. One notable event was the rise of the American Indian Movement, AIM, in the late 1960s. Though AIM's most famous actions came later, the seeds of activism were planted in the post-war decades as Native people grew frustrated with poverty, police harassment, and government policies. AIM and other organizations brought attention to issues such as treaty rights, religious freedom, and sovereignty, using protests, legal action, and public education to advance their causes. Culturally, this period also saw renewed interest in language preservation and traditional practices. Tribal colleges and cultural programs began to emerge, creating spaces where Native youth could learn about their heritage and prepare to lead their communities. Elders and storytellers played key roles in passing down knowledge, ensuring that despite decades of suppression, the richness of Native cultures would not be lost. Healthcare and education remained major concerns. Many reservations still lacked adequate facilities and resources, and rates of poverty, unemployment, and illness were high. Yet, persistent advocacy led to improvements, including increased federal funding and new programs designed to support Native communities in ways that respected their sovereignty and traditions. The post-war decades were a time of great struggle, but also of significant progress. Native American communities navigated the challenges of a rapidly changing world, balancing the pressures of assimilation with the desire to maintain their unique identities and rights. Their resilience and activism paved the way for the important legal and political victories of the late 20th century, including the restoration of tribal recognition and the affirmation of treaty rights. As you drift more deeply into rest, think of the enduring spirit of those who faced these post-war challenges, who fought to protect their lands, languages, and way of life. Their story is one of courage, patience, and unwavering hope, a quiet testament to the strength that can grow even in the harshest conditions. The struggle for sovereignty and justice continues, carried forward by generations who remember and honor the past while looking toward a brighter future. As the 20th century moved into its final decades, Native American communities across the United States experienced a profound awakening, a resurgence of activism, cultural pride, and political strength that sought to reclaim sovereignty and celebrate identity after centuries of hardship. This period marked a new chapter in Native American history, one filled with both challenges and hopeful progress, where the voices of indigenous peoples grew louder and more determined. The 1960s and 1970s, a time of civil rights movements throughout America, became a turning point for Native Americans. Inspired by other marginalized groups, Native activists began organizing more visibly, demanding respect for their treaties, recognition of their sovereignty, and justice for historical wrongs. This wave of activism challenged centuries-old policies that had sought to erase their cultures and control their lands. One of the most influential organizations to emerge during this time was the American Indian Movement, AIM, founded in 1968. AIM became a powerful voice advocating for Native rights, focusing on issues such as police brutality, poverty, treaty violations, and cultural preservation. Their activism included well-known protests and occupations, such as the 1973 standoff at Wounded Knee in South Dakota, which brought national and international attention to Native struggles. Though AIM's actions were often met with resistance and controversy, their efforts galvanized many Native Americans and allies across the country. Simultaneously, Native Americans began asserting greater control over education and cultural programs. Tribal colleges were established, creating spaces where indigenous knowledge, languages, and histories could be taught from Native perspectives. These institutions played a crucial role in cultural renewal, empowering young people to embrace their heritage and prepare for leadership roles within their communities. Language revitalization became a key focus. For generations, boarding schools and government policies had sought to suppress native languages, causing many to fall into decline. In response, tribal elders, educators, and linguists worked tirelessly to document and teach these languages, using modern technology alongside traditional methods. Today, many tribes offer immersion programs and online courses, ensuring that the voices of their ancestors continue to echo into the future. Legal battles also defined this era, as tribes fought to reclaim lands, uphold treaty rights, and gain recognition. Landmark court cases, such as Menominee, Tribe versus United States, and others, helped establish important legal precedents, affirming tribal sovereignty and rights. These victories were not just legal triumphs. They restored dignity and a sense of justice to communities long marginalized. Economic development became another important goal. Many tribes invested in enterprises such as casinos, tourism, and natural resource management, creating jobs and funding social services. These economic efforts helped reduce poverty and improve living conditions, though challenges remained. Cultural celebrations flourished as well, with powwows, art shows, music festivals, and other events becoming vibrant expressions of identity and pride. These gatherings welcomed not only Native people, but also allies eager to learn and support. Through art, dance, and storytelling, Native Americans shared their rich traditions with the wider world, breaking down stereotypes and fostering understanding. Despite these advances, Native communities continued to face significant obstacles. Poverty, health disparities, and political struggles were ongoing realities. Yet, the renewed sense of empowerment and unity built during this period laid a strong foundation for future generations. As you settle deeper into calm, imagine the bright flames of renewal flickering gently through communities across the land. Flames fueled by the courage of activists, the wisdom of elders, and the hopes of youth. This revival is a testament to a people who have endured, adapted, and flourished, carrying forward the legacy of their ancestors while forging paths toward a hopeful future. As we reach the final segment of this journey through history, it is important to reflect not only on the past struggles and victories of Native American peoples, but also on the ongoing path they continue to walk, a path marked by resilience, renewal, and the enduring hope for a just and thriving future. The closing decades of the 20th century and the dawn of the 21st have seen Native American nations increasingly assert their rights and sovereignty in new and powerful ways. Building on the foundations laid by earlier generations, tribal governments have strengthened their political standing, often negotiating agreements with federal and state governments that recognize their authority over lands, resources, and cultural affairs. One key area of progress has been in self-determination policies. Since the 1970s, the U.S. government has officially supported tribal control over education, healthcare, law enforcement, and economic development. This shift has empowered many tribes to design programs tailored to their unique needs and values, fostering community well-being and cultural preservation. It has also allowed for greater political representation and participation, giving Native Americans a louder voice in local, state, and national affairs. Economic revitalization continues to be a central focus. Many tribes have built successful enterprises, ranging from casinos and resorts to energy development and agriculture. These ventures provide crucial funding for social programs and infrastructure, helping improve quality of life and create jobs on reservations and in urban centers. Importantly, these developments often incorporate sustainable practices and respect for the land, reflecting deep cultural values tied to the environment. Cultural resurgence remains vibrant. Across the country, Native artists, musicians, writers, and filmmakers are sharing their stories and talents, contributing richly to the broader American cultural landscape while affirming their own identities. Language revitalization programs have expanded, supported by new technologies and community efforts, ensuring that native languages continue to thrive and evolve. Education plays a vital role in this ongoing journey. Tribal colleges and universities, now numbering over 30, offer not only academic degrees, but also cultural immersion and leadership training. They serve as hubs for research, advocacy, and community engagement, fostering pride and empowerment among young Native Americans. Legal and political battles persist, too, as tribes defend treaty rights, environmental protections, and sovereignty. Landmark court cases and policy debates continue to shape the relationship between Native nations and the federal government. These efforts often draw national attention, reminding the broader public of the importance of justice and respect for indigenous peoples. In contemporary society, Native Americans also confront issues such as health disparities, poverty, and access to resources. Yet, with resilience and innovation, many communities develop creative solutions rooted in tradition and modern knowledge. Grassroots organizations work alongside tribal governments, NGOs, and allies to address these challenges holistically, weaving together social, cultural, and economic strands. The younger generations are especially vital to this forward momentum. Young Native Americans are embracing their heritage while engaging with global issues like climate change, social justice, and technological advancement. They bring fresh perspectives and energy to activism, culture, and leadership, ensuring that the story of their people continues to evolve with strength and dignity. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine this ongoing journey as a long river, sometimes swift and turbulent, sometimes calm and steady, carrying forward the hopes, dreams, and resilience of countless generations. The river flows through diverse landscapes, weaving together stories of survival, struggle, and renewal. Though the challenges have been many, the enduring spirit of Native American nations shines brightly, a beacon of strength and hope. Their history is not just a chapter in the past, but a living, breathing narrative that continues to unfold, inviting all of us to listen, learn, and walk forward with respect and understanding. Now, as your mind settles and your body relaxes, allow the quiet strength of this journey to lull you into peaceful rest. The story of these resilient peoples reminds us that even in the face of adversity, hope and renewal are always possible, carried gently forward by those who remember, honor, and dream.